IVM.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. On May the 3rd, World Press Freedom Day, the France-based media watchdog Reporters Without Borders released its annual Press Freedom Index that showed India had slipped from 142 to 150 in the global rankings of 180 countries. That is the lowest India has ever been. Journalism in India, as we know, has become a very hazardous profession, and many journalists have been killed or jailed in recent years. Recently, Fahad Shah, editor of the Kashmir Wala, was rearrested immediately after being released on bail for his crime of allegedly glorifying terrorism. Siddique Kapan has been in jail in UP for nearly 600 days. I must remind you that Siddique Kapan is from Kerala. He had gone there to cover a story. How does RSF, which is Reporters Without Borders, measure press freedom and come up with these rankings? Why did it lower India's rank when India is a democracy with a thriving media? Our guest today is Daniel Bastar, who is the director of the Asia Pacific desk of the Paris-based Reporters Without Borders and therefore was directly involved in researching countries from the region. A journalist and press freedom activist, he has reported from several countries such as Indonesia, Italy, and Brazil for a range of well-known media organizations such as Associated Press and Le Monde. Daniel Bastar, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you, Sidharth. I'm very happy to be here with your viewers and listeners.
Okay, tell us a bit about Reporters Without Borders and also the index.
Okay, so Reporters Without Borders is an organization that was founded almost 40 years ago in 1985. And since the beginning, our mandate is the defense of press freedom, or the digital age, let's say the defense of freedom of the right to information for citizens, and the defense of an ethical journalism. So that's what we are attached to. And we work with 130 correspondents all over the world. In India, we have 4 correspondents and 1 representative. And our main task is to, of course, monitor press freedom violations in the world, and especially and notably in India. We also do some assistance towards journalists who are at risk. So it can be some journalists who are the target of death threats, for instance. We can come up with solutions, for instance, just basically installing some CCTV in front of their house, but we also can relocate these journalists to a safer place within their country or outside that country. That's something that we've done with some Indian journalists in the past. And of course, we do also some advocacy. We believe in the dialogue with governments, with international organizations, with companies. So we try to have a dialogue. We've tried to have a dialogue with the union government in India. It's quite difficult. So I thought it's good to have a dialogue with the state governments as well, for instance, in India. But we also try to report some violations to UN bodies. That's something that we did after Gauri Lankesh was murdered back in 2017. And then some other women journalists got threats like Yarna Hayub, also Swati Chaturvedi. So we would report these cases to the UN, and then the UN would send a letter to Indian authorities. And we do also some advocacy towards big companies. More recently, that's something that we did with Myanmar, with the situation in Myanmar, where we realized that international official advocacy was not really effective because the junta in Myanmar doesn't care. So we thought, okay, maybe if we try to report some violations, some serious violations of press freedom and freedom of information to the companies who are operating in Myanmar. Maybe we can have some leverage to convince the generals in Myanmar to ease their crackdown on press freedom, more or less. That's very concretely how we work. We have several offices in Taipei, in Washington DC, in London, in Dakar, in West Africa, in Brussels, and we also work with some sections in other European countries. Like we have a big team in Germany, for instance, who have their autonomy, their financial autonomy, but we work closely with our sister organizations in several European states.
So how do you prepare the index? Because that's really one of your annual highlights, isn't it?
Yeah, so the index, this year in 2022, it's the 20th edition of the World Press Freedom Index. The first one was in 2002. So it's every year we release it in either April or May, like this year. And it's a year-long work. We use two kinds of data to come up with this index. The first kind of data is what we call quantitative data. It means that throughout the year we have a database that we fill up with any kind of violation of press freedom. So, of course, when a journalist is murdered, of course, this that we would put it in our database. But also when a journalist is molested by the police when covering a demonstration, for instance, that's another kind of violation. So all these violations, and of course, when a journalist is sentenced to 10 years in jail, like this can happen in China or Vietnam, for instance, then we would also put it in our database. And we have several. The database help us to come up with a score. We call it the exactions score, which gives us an insight of the level of violations of press freedom in one country throughout the year. So that's the quantitative data, which is also our method of establishing this score, takes into account the population of the country, for instance. In the case of India, it's very important because India is one of the deadliest countries for journalists in the world, but it is also one of the second most populated country. So we also take it into account. So that's one part. The other part is what we call the qualitative study. It consists in we have a questionnaire of around 100 questions about press freedom in general. We have 5 indicators. I can come into details about these indicators later. But basically, we try to identify around 10 experts on press freedom for each country. So it can be either senior or younger journalists, scholars, media expert, law experts, and we would just send them these questionnaire, and then depending on their answers, we come up with a qualitative score, and then all this is mixed so that we can come up with a score for each country, which help us to establish the ranking of the 180 countries that we study in the World Press Freedom Index.
I was thinking that, the top countries are usually has been the Nordic countries. Finland, Denmark is number 2 this year, Sweden, Norway, etc. And even those countries must be having some laws against freedom of expression, against what journalists can print and all that. So it's not as though the law doesn't exist. Laws do exist. How do you then distinguish between, because in India, the laws exist. Freedom of expression is guaranteed. Freedom of the press is not guaranteed, but we have all those laws, we have the courts and all. So how do you bring that into it?
I'll start by giving you an example, which I know very well, which is Vietnam. Article 19 of the Constitution of the People's Republic of Vietnam says that press freedom is a fundamental freedom of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. But in the criminal code in Vietnam, you can be jailed for what is called propaganda against the state. And the court won't take into account the fact that press freedom is guaranteed by the Constitution. The court would take into account the fact that you have violated the penal code, saying that you just did some propaganda against the state. And so the law is one thing, and the application of the law is another thing. And that is totally taken into account in our questionnaire. Like one of the questions would be, is press freedom guaranteed in the Constitution? Does this country has ratified the civil and political rights pact, for instance, or the International Covenant on Political and Civic Rights? But then the other question would be, are these rights actually applied? And I come up with the Indian case after that. That's something that a law expert on India told me. He told me that the law in India is very precise, very well done, but it's not applied. And so when you have a very good law, well, you have very good legal guarantees on paper, that doesn't mean that the judge won't choose this or that to crack down on press freedom. And, there are several articles, several sections in Indian Penal Code that allow a judge to just crack down on press freedom on the grounds of national security, violation of the Sedition Act, many laws like that would allow a tribunal to put the journalist in jail.
Yeah, but what about countries like Norway or France? France, for example, I mean, wouldn't they have national laws, national security laws? Or what about England, where the D notice can suddenly come at midnight and stop a story from coming? So even these countries do have something on paper which can overrule everything, isn't it? So tell us about them.
Yes. Okay. So Norway is number one in the World Press Freedom Index. Norway, the system in Norway is not perfect. Clearly not. Perfection is an ideal, and there are some issues. But the thing is that when there is, what makes the difference, let's say, is that when there is a problematic decision by court in Norway or in UK or in France, the decision would be debated among the press, and newspapers can have different interpretation of what a judge said, so that what we call the fourth pillar totally play its role in questioning the other powers. Let's say questioning the acts of the government, of the parliament, and of the judiciary. And if some journalist has a point in saying that, okay, this judge is not so independent, this judge seemed to be very close to this politician who was criticized by this journalist, and we believe that this judge was not very partial towards this journalist, well, then this should be made public, and so you would have a debate in the press, and so you would have counterpowers. It's very important, and the fourth pillar must be a counterpower. And so when there is this kind of problematic situation, then the press would be able to talk about it and to not to let the debate die by itself. So I think that's what makes the difference between the law on paper and the way it is applied and the way people would react to it.
The reason I'm pressing this point, frankly, is because there is a perception among countries like India and maybe other countries also that organizations such as yours keep looking at only and pointing fingers at the third world, at the global south, rather than at the global north. because the US is hardly a country where, there's a lot of press freedom, but there's a lot of ways to pressure it also. And as I said, in England too. So how do you address that?
I totally understand your point of view. For instance, we are based in Paris, we are based in France. We are very critical on the situation of press freedom in our own country, not especially in terms of media ownership, for instance. But I will just come up with, when you look at the top countries in the index, of course, the three ones are Nordic countries, which are, there really is a Nordic model. A Northern European model that should inspire countries like France, but also like the US. The situation in the US is very, very problematic. So I will give you two Asian examples. One is Timor. Timor-Leste is between Indonesia and Australia. It's really an emerging democracy. It's been independent for 20 years now. But they have a very good record in terms of press freedom. And they are clearly from what we call the South. I don't really like to this division between North and South, because Australia is not really the North. But you can see that we have a new methodology this year. And thanks to this, we could find out that a country like East Timor is very highly ranked. Another example is Costa Rica in Central America, which is a very interesting model of press freedom that should inspire European countries, for instance. And I will give you a counterexample, which is one of the fight that we are very attached to at RSF, is the possible transfer of Julian Assange to the US. He risks 130 years of jail just for giving public interest information to the public and to journalists. And this is one of the major global problems for press freedom, and those who must be pointed out because for that are the governments in the UK, in the US, and also in Europe, because, for instance, no European country would dare to welcome Julian Assange as a refugee, as he should deserve, because he's really, really persecuted because of what he did and the public interest work that he did. So the index must not be seen as the imposition of a model. We can find some inspiration from these Northern European countries, but also, as I said, from countries like Costa Rica, from Timor-Leste, or a neighbor of India like Bhutan, which is really, really a young emerging democracy as well. They have quite a good record in terms of press freedom, because the debate is, except some taboos like the monarchy, the debate is quite open. There is some respect of the work of journalists. So that's something that can be inspirational for countries in what we call the South.
So, Daniel, I think you reported from India, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
That was in the early 2000s?
No, 2011 and 12.
What changes have you seen since then as far as press freedom is concerned?
There is a big change, of course. I must say, okay, as I said before, India is one of the deadliest countries for journalists. It's very difficult to be a journalist in India when you cover clashes, demonstrations, things like that. But if you look at the numbers of journalists who were murdered in India 10 years ago, it was more or less the same. So on this point, that's a structural problem, violence against journalists, but it's not really new. What has really changed is the fact that the government wants to impose a narrative and manages to impose a narrative within the mainstream media. There has always been a very high level of concentration among the media in India, but what we have seen, what I have witnessed in the, let's say, 8 last years, is a very strong political leverage. Mainstream media tend to follow the narrative imposed by either the union government or the state governments. But at the national level, it's really worrying to see that some mainstream media are just following the narrative of the government, and that any media which is critical of the government is deemed anti-national, anti-Indian, and so there is the media has been very polarized. A media like The Wire, who is trying to give some trustful, independent news, is often deemed as anti-national because journalists won't follow the government's narrative, basically. As a foreign journalist, what has changed dramatically as well is that now foreign journalists are not allowed to go to several places in India, not only Kashmir, but also the northeast, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand. Now it has become very difficult for some journalists to just go into some parts of the country, and even for vacation. So I have the case of one journalist who just wanted to visit some friend in the northeast in Manipur. He wasn't allowed to go there because he's a journalist. And, before living in India, I stayed 6 years in China. That was from 2004 and 2010. And really, the situation in China was much better. It was before Xi Jinping came to power. 15 years ago, the Chinese society was much more open than it is now. You had some independent new outlets, and I think now India is, to some aspects, is turning into some aspects I have seen in China, where some territories are not allowed to foreign or domestic journalists. And just to give you one example, I had a talk with a journalist who is based in Srinagar, in Kashmir, a couple of months ago. And he clearly told me that from the description he told me, I just thought it really seemed like the situation in Tibet with China, like a very a region which is totally closed to the press, where you have one administration, not a local government, one administration who just gives the narratives, and all the news outlets who don't follow this narrative are harassed, more or less, either economically or legally. And the fact that you mentioned the situation of Fahad Shah, the chief editor of the Kashmir Wala, at the beginning of this discussion is very emblematic of the situation.
So India has fallen from 142 to 150 in 1 year. Mm-hmm. Now, that's quite a fall. What has happened during this 1 year to warrant this drastic change?
Okay, first I have to say that there might be kind of bias because we updated our methodology from 2021 to 2022. So this must be taken into account. And what lies behind this is that we are now more able to measure the influence of economical powers, the influence of corporate industries on the media, and we are more able to measure phenomena like censorship and self-censorship. That's something that we managed to better address. And so at the beginning of this program, I mentioned this score we come up with when we do the study. And we give more leverage to influence by corporate companies on the level of censorship and self-censorship, and also media concentration and the influence of media concentration is more taken into account now. So I think this explains why there is such a drop in the case of India. If you look at, but that's phenomenon that we can see with neighboring countries of India. Bangladesh is going down, Pakistan is going down, Sri Lanka is going down. So it's that's this weighting, this change of weighting must be taken into account. I think that can explain why the ranking, the drop is so big. Apart from that, the situation of the security of journalists on ground has not changed. Last year, 4 journalists were killed because of their work. The level of impunity is still very high. We're still waiting for a proper trial for the murder of Gauri Lankesh, for instance. So all this hasn't been better from one year to the other, and the fact that we take more into account the weight of the corporate influence over the media, I think might explain why India has dropped so severely from 21 to.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Do you wonder why China does the things that it does? Or want to know how we could improve online privacy? Or perhaps you're thinking about how we can kickstart India's economy. If you'd like to search for the answers to such questions, check out All Things Policy, a daily public policy podcast that covers everything from employment figures to aircraft carriers. Tune in from Monday to Friday for new episodes and fresh takes.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. But Daniel, when you see a country like India, the laws are in place. As you said, they are really well written. The institutions are free. There is a lot of noise in the press, which doesn't get censored before it appears. Then what makes India different from so many other countries? And it's a democracy.
Yes, it's the world's largest democracy, as we say. I mean, it's very problematic. Of course, you say that there is a lot of fuzz and buzz, but it's limited to a certain elite. I mean, a lot of Indian population doesn't have access to some trustful information, and that's a global problem. But that's really sensitive in the case of India, because I mean, I would come with the issue of social media, especially Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, which is very important in India. Where you have this bubble phenomenon where people don't have access anymore to a pluralistic range of information. And the BJP, led by Prime Minister Modi, has developed this, what we call the IT cell of the BJP, which has become famous now. But it has developed a very elaborate way to let's say, manipulate information, and that's as I said, that's a global problem. The election of Donald Trump in the US was made possible by Facebook, more or less. The Brexit in UK was made possible by some misinformation on Facebook as well. This has been proven. But the BJP, and especially those people who are around Narendra Modi, were really, I mean, they were very early. They were very, let's say, sharp in using these tools to propagate their own message. And in the end, as I said, our mandate in Reporters Without Borders is to defend press freedom and to defend the right to a trustful information. And that's where there is a problem in India, is that the average Indian citizen doesn't have access to a pluralistic range of information, the way that especially the union government, but it's also true with the different state governments as well, are really manipulating the news both on social media and on mainstream media, makes it difficult for information to be shared fairly towards Indian citizens.
You may have got a point there, and that is that, for example, when people see the news on television at night, and TV continues to be popular, it has a huge reach. Forget social media. There are a lot of people not on social media. But when they see the TV news, that's all they're getting. At best, they get somebody calling them at home to say, this is what I've heard, and that then adds to that TV news. Plus, there is a little bit of confirmation bias. So the mass of the people are getting the same old thing day after day after day. And it's propaganda, but for them, that becomes news. So the problem lies with the media too. I mean, you'll defend somebody being arrested by the government. Of course you should. But the problem is actually now with the media. And then for that crony media, you will have to develop some new way of looking at things.
No, but yes, you really have a good point. But I mentioned that in our questionnaire that we use to come up with this World Press Freedom Index, one important part is about the pluralism of views and media pluralism, and I think that's a key as well. As I said, in working democracies, when you look at the news at night, you have a range of views which can be opposed or complementary. And in these, what you said, crony media, you don't have that. I know that there's also this expression in India, which is the Gaudy media, which is a pun between multimedia and laptop media. A lot of my Indian journalist friends would always come up with this expression of Indian media from watchdog to lapdog. That's something that comes up a lot, and but I mean that's something that we take into account. We are certainly not here to judge media, the quality of media, or that's not our and who can judge the quality of media? We are not. We have no legitimacy to judge the content of the media. What we try to evaluate is the way one media or one media outlet or media outlets in general in a country are able to give a plurality of views and of opinions. And that's a global problem as well. And we are very attached to this. I mean, one of the themes that we put forward when we released our World Press Freedom Index this year is this tendency of polarization of the debate. In the West, we took Fox News in the US as an example. But in India, I mean, Republic TV is another example. We just come out from an electoral period in France where we have exactly the same news channel, which was clearly supporting a far right candidate with absolutely no pluralistic views. I mean, no debate among its waves. So it is something that we need to take into account, but we don't want to judge one media outlet or another. We really need to see how much independent information this media outlet is able to give. The problem is not to accuse journalists of not doing their jobs as well. Journalists are just human beings who have to pay some bills, who have an husband or a wife, who have kids to take care, and who have to obey a hierarchy. And that's also where we try to identify the problem, if there is some total editorial freedom or not, and that's where we measure these.
So tell me, have you seen countries actually going up the rankings over the last few years? And if so, how did they achieve it? And how can India achieve it?
Mhm. Okay, I'll start with one remark, which is not in favor of India, but that's totally excusable. If you look at the 10 or 15 countries that are at the highest in the Press Freedom Index, all of them have quite a small population. It seems that when you have a rather small population, you are less susceptible to be the subject of media manipulation.
I'll just interrupt there, Daniel. There are many countries in the Far East with very small populations, and I rest my case. So Hong Kong had a thriving media, and you know what's going on there. So I think that is just one criteria, but yes, sure, go ahead.
It's absolutely not a definite criteria. I have a very, my counterexample of press freedom is Singapore, which has a very, very small population, but which has one of the worst situations in terms of press freedom. So, of course, it's not, there's nothing mathematical in it. But that was just, that's one remark that I cannot, that's just how it is. It seems easier when you're a small country to promote press freedom. Well, that's just one remark. Another thing, I think one of the decisive issues in a country like India, where the insecurity for journalists is very high, is the fight against impunity. That's a major problem, and that should be, I think, addressed by the prosecutor office in India, by the government and by the justice system. Many journalists who were murdered are just not served justice. Their family don't find justice, and I think some progress must be made in this regard. Another major aspect is to recognize the work of journalists as something healthy for democracy. You know, there have been some election recently in UP, and the situation of press freedom in UP is very bad. It's very, very worrying. It's a huge state, it's the biggest state in India. I think, if we take the population of UP, it would be the 4th or 5th country in the world. And the situation is very bad because there is a real harassment of journalists who are not following the narrative of the government. You mentioned the case of Siddiqui Kapan, who is a journalist from Kerala, who was going to report on the case of, I think it was a rape on a minor girl, and he's still in jail. This is harassment, and this is showing disrespect toward the work of journalists. And I think that's I mean, it's not easy to decide like this. Okay, we will respect the work of journalists, but this calls for, I think, a collective thinking of the role of the press. And India is deemed as the world's largest democracy, but a democracy must be functioning. It's a never-ending process. And I think now the 4th pillar in India is in danger, and there should be a global debate about that.
So you see, to wind this up, do you see the situation getting worse?
There is always room for betterment. I really believe that. I believe there is always room for dialogue. But this calls for some responsibility and some authentic will to make things better. I'll give you one example. 2 years ago, the union government in India said they were unhappy with several rankings of the country in international rankings. So they came up with this World Press Freedom Index monitoring cell. So we were very happy about this initiative. because we can have a dialogue with the Indian authorities and a very constructive discussion about how to ease the situation of press freedom in India. It turns out that this commission was made by, there were 15 members. There were only 2 journalist representatives, and all of them were government officials. And I had a meeting with the Indian ambassador in Paris, and then I had a working session with the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. What turned out is that this commission just wanted to lobby us so that we would give India a better note. But that is not how it works. We have a methodology. We follow a methodology, and so we came up with we couldn't create a genuine dialogue, because when I said, okay, maybe you should have to act on, as I said, on the fight against impunity for crimes against journalists, on media security, all these concrete things that can be made by the government. They just said, no, they said that we're having a Western bias. Which is difficult to understand when all the experts that we interview in order to have a qualitative measurement of the position of India in terms of press freedom. All of them are from India. We don't take international experts we take Indian experts who know very concrete the situation. So just these examples shows you why things shouldn't be taken lightly. If change has been made, it has been made genuinely and not just for showing off.
So, listeners, I think there you have it, that this is a dialogue of the deaf with foreign press freedom monitors, but it's also a dialogue of the deaf as far as the media in India is concerned and the authorities. The situation, as we know, has gotten worse, especially for independent journalists. And it is my conviction that a lot of journalists in India by themselves are extremely independent. Sometimes they get pressured by their own organizations. Sometimes they get pressured from the government and also by social structures which do not respect journalists. That was Daniel Bastar, Director of Asia and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, talking to us from the headquarters of the Reporters Without Borders in Paris, which has just come out with an index showing that India's ranking has dramatically declined this year. And looks like nothing drastic is going to change over the next few years. So India will continue languishing way down. This is a very pessimistic situation, but for journalists in India and in the rest of the world, the mission is clear. You've got to report truthfully and honestly to fulfill your mandate. Thank you, Daniel, very much for giving us a global perspective on media freedom and about what is going wrong in India and why its rankings have dropped.
Thank you, Sidharth.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On The Habit Coach, Dr. Madan Kataria tells Ashton how laughter yoga came to be. On Pesa Vesa Anupamas Mukesh Kalra, founder and CEO at ET Money, about their new intelligent investment service, ET Money Genius. On Smarter with Sid, Sidharth explores the relationship between Twitter, free speech, and Elon Musk. On The Habit Coach, Ashton shares tips on how to not abandon a new habit midway. And on Say No to Drama, Chetna guides us through a process to better identify our intuition. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're following this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth is one of our biggest, most helpful things you could do for us. We'd really appreciate that. And also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. Go check out ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. You get a list of all of our YouTube channels there. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and the advertising on the network. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It's at ivmpodcast.com/survey. This really helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors for this week, SBI Life Insurance, India Water Portal, and Jupiter, a digital banking app.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.